Come on over here. Over here. Well, hello, everybody. It's your girl, Delores Jones, the comeback coach, and welcome to a special edition of Finally Free. Let me tell you something. There is so much going on in the world. So according to breaking news, the 11 soccer players and their coach were rescued finally. Thank God for
that.
Okay. But one of the things we have to think about is trauma after the rescue. Another thing that I who are committing suicide at alarming numbers. And let's just say what the world needs now, I know, is love, sweet love, but we also need some answers. And so I want to welcome my good friend back to the show, to Finally Free, Mr. Gerald Payne.
Thank you.
Who is a psychotherapist, and he comes and joins the Queens. Hello, Queens. How are y'all doing?
Hey, Queen.
You see, they're there. And also want to say hello to the Fly Nubian Queens, because I'm exclusively streaming. Hi, with you all. You all are wonderful. Okay, you are wonderful. Yes. So kind of fill us in. So, everybody is celebrating that the 11 soccer players and their coach, he's about 25 years old.
A young guy.
They were there for almost 2 weeks.
Yes. They got backed up into this cave.
And the water was coming and it was racing.
Yes.
But I read that the coach practices, does he deal with Buddhism? I'm not really sure what his spiritual background is, but he was studying to be a monk. Exactly. And so he was able to teach the kids, the players, some of the practices in order for them to hold on and not let go in the midst of that, but then of course we know that one of the divers died. He was actually responsible for taking the oxygen into the children and their coach. And I am just amazed actually at what went down, because I want you to picture this. In order to locate them and bring them out, and so they had to send 2 divers in per person, because I saw this, this actual picture of the water, and then they would have to release the kid to go through a tiny hole above ground in order for them to come back down.
Drilling.
Right. And that is a miracle. That's all I'm going to say.
It's a miracle.
Yes.
At the same time, just imagine how traumatizing that is.
Some of us are afraid of the dark. I mean, I know you turn the light off and people freak out.
I know 18-year-olds that are still sleeping with their light on.
I get a night light sometimes. Well, I don't use it now, but
you don't need no night light.
Anyway, I used to. But let's talk about the what do you call it? Secondhand trauma and post-traumatic stress that you already know from
secondary PTSD,
secondary post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
And bring us up to date about the firefighters.
Okay. Well, the underlying issue is PTSD. People who experience trauma can experience PTSD at the same time. What is frequently overlooked is that the rescuers, the helping professionals who are showing up on the scene, are very vulnerable and susceptible to what I call secondary PTSD. And so, because you can become traumatized by walking up on a scene that is traumatic. But everyone focuses primarily on the actual victims and getting them the help that they need, whereas the EMTs and the firefighters and the police officers, the rescue divers, it's just considered to be a part of their job. And so a lot of times no one thinks that, hey, how are they coping with what they have witnessed and what they have experienced? It's like, I had a client who was a former EMT, and he was seeing me for therapy for PTSD. He was suffering from PTSD from years ago, showing up at a scene where it was a car accident scene, and it was a mother and her four saw when he showed up was them decapitated.
Oh.
So it was some twins, a set of twins, and another kid. If you are a first responder, even though in the moment they're in, okay, I have to help this person, I have to help this family, I'm here to save lives. It's afterwards. It's at the end of the day and the subsequent days and weeks that follow that a person begins to have the nightmares about it and the flashbacks. Because if you see 3 children decapitated, you are not going to be able to just continue with your job as usual. But because society says, hey, this is their job, they're fine. And they say, hey, this is my job, I'm fine. And they don't want to they don't want to believe. And then there's the stigma on mental health. And so they don't want to believe that, hey, I need some help to deal with this because, well, I'm a first responder. This is what we do, and we're tough and we're strong and we're the ones that save. So I'm not going to go to therapy for PTSD to get help. Like, nobody's saving me. I'm saving other people. And so it just continues and continues and continues until they either reach a depth of depression to the point where they become suicidal or they end up in hospitals. But there needs to be more preventative work done, just acknowledging, hey, you just saw 3 decapitated children. You need to take some time off
work.
We need for you to sit down with, so and so and so are, they need a department counselor or something. Like, we need for you to process through this. But like I said, it oftentimes does not happen. You got all these people working in emergency rooms. And when you think about even therapists, when I'm supervising therapists, I remember when I worked on the sex offender treatment team at the community mental health center, and it was a team of therapists. We all had like 80 to 85 clients on our caseload. And the vast majority of my clients were sex offenders. And so in working 10-hour days, to spend 10 hours hearing stories of childhood sexual abuse in grave detail, I remember for myself, it began to affect me. I began to, the stories would replay in my head. And everywhere, when you are seeing that many sex offenders, everywhere you go, you see one. You go to Burger King and, hey, Gerald, hey. You go to Walmart, hey, like, they're everywhere.
And they acknowledge you. And so then you go back to the story.
Well,
in your head?
No, your thoughts at that time is they're everywhere. What is he doing to her?
Right. Was that kind of like countertransference?
No. Transference is when your client, where you begin to represent someone in their past. Countertransference is when the client begins to represent someone in your past.
Gotcha.
What this is just secondary PTSD. Like, you become traumatized by other people's trauma, by their traumatic experiences, and it begins to take an effect upon you because a person, the human brain can only handle so much. And so you have to do proper and healthy self-care. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up transferring from that unit because spending the whole day
Right.
either listening to children tell their trauma stories about being sexually abused, or like I could see a, a, a victim of sexual abuse at 11, and then at 12 I'm seeing a perpetrator of sexual abuse,
And
that's
then you
just
go
how the day,
home
and
at 5 o'clock.
that's how the day goes at 8 o'clock.
At 8 o'clock, and then you're with your wife. Well, at that
Yes.
time you weren't married.
I wasn't married at the time.
Okay.
But I would go home. I mean, my nephew was living with me. I was raising my nephew, and so I had to learn how to shut it off and compartmentalize it. At the same time, I had to realize that for me to be in society and see parents with their children and to always be suspicious and like I'm ready to hotline somebody, they haven't done anything. I'm ready to hotline. Got the hotline on speed dial. I realized like,
You
okay,
were like,
this
were
is.
you paranoid? Was that it? Or
It's
more
like a
suspicious?
paranoia. It's
Okay.
like a paranoia.
Okay.
Like you just get worried for all children, and so
Because you now think that the world
is horrible,
is horrible because you've spent so many
and that
hours.
all children are in
So
danger.
you're looking at about 10 hours a day.
Yes,
How many days did you work?
4 days a week.
4 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
That's 40 hours of
There.
just listening
Yes.
to horrible things happening to children.
Yes. And I was doing 3 days a week of private practice, but I wasn't seeing that population. But in transferring off of that unit, it allowed me to better manage a caseload.
Yes.
To where even to this day, I might have 1, maybe 2 sex offenders in therapy. Because after that, it's too much.
You just said I can't handle it.
It's too much. Like,
Okay.
because it taints your view of the world.
Okay, so speaking of the world, I want to thank everyone, the Fly New Queens that are watching streaming this morning or this afternoon with me, Delores Jones, your comeback coach with Finally Free, moving you beyond labels, limitations, and low self-esteem. So you're free to be powerful, successful, and unstoppable, and anything else that gets in your way of being great. Today, what we're talking about is suicide as a result of secondhand trauma. So I would also like you to subscribe to the flynubianqueen.com, because if you're enjoying discussions like this, then this is definitely where you want to be. So Gerald Payne is my special guest. He is a psychotherapist, and he is with the practice Payne, Hogan, and Associates.
Yes.
Okay. And so what Gerald was saying, for those of you that are just now joining me, is the service people like a firefighter or even a social worker
First responders.
or first responders, the person that is on the scene after the accident has happened and they witness the trauma, they are now suffering from secondhand post-traumatic stress, which what it looks like, I guess, for different people are different things. And so Gerald is going to give us a couple of, some warning signs. I know the nightmares, the flashbacks. And like you talked about, so Gerald was saying that he worked with the sex offender population for years, starting out.
Victims,
Offenders. And so here he is sitting every day listening to these horrible things that person has done or that has been done to the person. And so he just spoke about a firefighter, I guess, here locally, or
Yes.
just someone you worked with, the firefighter, okay,
Yes.
that he came on the scene and he saw 3 children decapitated.
Yeah, that was the former EMT.
Okay, did he pass
but
away?
I've had, no, the EMT.
So an EMT,
No.
the person on the emergency,
He made it to therapy, but at the time that he came to therapy
Mhm.
to address it, this is a scene that had been haunting him for like 5 or 6 years.
Oh.
He'd been carrying it with him.
How did he describe it to you?
In doing the PTSD therapy, because there's evidence-based practices, and it's a long story about that, but the evidence-based PTSD treatment that I was using with him is called prolonged exposure therapy. And in prolonged exposure therapy, the person has to do a process of systematic desensitization, which is retelling their trauma story in first person as if it is currently happening.
Okay.
And so they do this over and over and over again, repeatedly, to systematically desensitize from it and to process through the trauma. Because as they're going through it, more memories will come to surface,
Yes.
things that they had blocked out. And so all of that needs to be processed all the way through the brain so that they can begin the healing process.
So how did you help someone process? So just give us an example.
He starts at the beginning of the story.
So was this the person who saw the 3 children with
Yes,
their...
this is the
Okay, so he tells you the story.
And in doing this therapy, he has to start at the beginning of the story, and from the time that they got the call and they arrived on the scene, and what he saw
Okay.
and what he did.
What he saw.
Because they automatically go into rescue mode because that's their profession.
So they have to...
It's not until later that it begins to catch up with them.
Yes.
And so him telling the story over and over again on walking up, running up on that scene to that vehicle and seeing those decapitated children. Okay. And he had been carrying it with him for years because it was overlooked that he might even have PTSD. Because in our society, when people think about PTSD, they're thinking about the military, active duty military and veterans. And so that is where the primary focus is. And so all of your medical professionals working in emergency rooms, your firefighters, your police officers, your social workers, all of these people are getting overlooked. And so, it's like if I'm seeing a firefighter in therapy and he is describing what it is like to experience, burnt or charred bodies, or people who they attempted to save and were not able to, or their colleagues getting killed in these accidents and different things like that. But there's not enough services in place to help them. They just carry it and carry it and carry it.
So
and what happens is,
how do we help?
Well,
what happens? It ends up what? I'm sorry for cutting you off.
It ends up building up. And when it overflows, that's when the breakdown occurs.
And what does the breakdown look like?
The breakdown
in
can
so many
look
ways.
like, experiencing suicidal ideations, feeling like I can't continue, I can't go on, I'm haunted by the images.
They're following me. They're in my sleep.
They are haunting me. It's like being haunted by these images, because flashbacks, when you think about the symptoms of PTSD, you have nightmares. And not every person experiences all these symptoms, but let's just go over some of them. The most problematic ones: flashbacks, which is, a person with PTSD can be sitting here having a conversation with you, and all of a sudden an image of a charred body or a decapitated child comes to their mind while they're trying to have a conversation with you. This is extremely difficult. Because it can have a dissociative effect. Like they are no longer in the moment with you. They are there. They're back at that dark place. The same thing with our military, who may be trying to walk through a mall and it's a crowded mall, and all of a sudden they are back at war and they have a meltdown because they are back at that place. They're not here with us in the present. Imagine the 4th of July. Because I went to a friend's house and there was a drunken veteran there, and all he could say in his intoxicated state of mind was, I can't handle this. I can't handle this. But he couldn't get away from it. It was the 4th of July. And so, like, even if you're in your house, even if you go down in your basement, you're going to hear
the fireworks.
You're going to hear the fireworks. And especially like the M80s that are like the M80s are ridiculously loud. So imagine, to a person who is struggling with PTSD from being in war, and you hear an M80, because in my neighborhood, someone close by had a lot of M80s. And we Mr. Walker, and so we're hearing it's like bombs going off.
And so do you
And I don't
panic?
even have
Go
PTSD.
into survival mode?
Yeah,
You ready to shoot somebody?
Well, what happens? Their brain immediately clicks into, because when they were at war and they would hear that, they immediately went into action, like survival mode. And so if they hear it, it's a PTSD trigger. And so in their mind, it snaps them out of the present and takes them back to that place. And so when you have people who snap and then go into combat mode with their family and their neighbors, but in their mind, they're not seeing their family and their neighbors.
Let's look.
They're seeing the enemy.
What does that look like when you say that they go into combat mode with their family?
They grab a gun and start waving it around. They're ready to protect themselves, because in that moment, it's like being removed from the present and taken back to that scene, that place.
Well, how do you help us or help them? Because I will say that as a social worker, master's level social worker, I think the year was 2000 and was it 10 or 9 or 8? Mm-hmm. I went in to see my doctor, Dr. Lee, and she looks at me and she says, Delores, I need you to come out of social work. I need you not to have a caseload of 50 people with problems. And the reason I even chose social work in the first place, and you know that it's known as, what do we say? It's the place for the wounded healer. Mm-hmm. So because we've been wounded and we don't want anybody else to hurt, then we step into that place to help guide people through their hurt. But then there comes a point, well, in my life, there came a point where she said, hey, there's enough.
It's too much.
Right. She said, now you can take your social work skills, but you cannot stay in social work. Well, what did I do? I went and got another job in social work because I was like, I got to pay off these student loans.
And there's always a need.
And what happened is eventually my mind said, we are not doing this, Jones.
Right.
And then I had an all-out episode of post-traumatic stress and then bipolar disorder 2. And then people look at you, you go to church and you're the life of the party. Mm-hmm. And then you go home and you don't know that it's okay for you to be not as happy all the time. It's okay for you to cry. It's okay for you to ask for help.
And you need to cry.
I need to cry. Yes. But if you looked at the trauma, me losing my mom when I was 5, she was murdered. Okay. And then we go into age, that's 5. And you go into school and you're being taunted and you're teased, and then you see the family secrets, you see the drug use, and then now you're homeless, and now you're trying to hide the secret because you don't want anybody to know. And as we say, Black folk don't tell family business. And so next you get into a relationship with a man and it's toxic, and you just keep going. And I remember when I first got married, I was 23 years old and I was 2 hours late to my own wedding. They said the bride is not coming.
He thought he was stood up at that.
Well, okay. I was in the shower and my best friend, Lysandra, was like, Dee Dee, we have to go. And it's like you said, in that moment, I just said, it's time for me to turn on.
Right.
And so I got there and I was smiling and I walked down the aisle and I said, I do. And I knew I didn't. And then we went to the honeymoon, and if there was no honey in the moon, I literally broke down crying. And so then I kept, I tried to be this wife. I tried to be this minister's wife. And I remember one day while I was married, I crawled up on the sofa and got into a fetal position. And I started crying out to my mother. And I said, Mama, I just need you to tell me I'm going to be okay. And he came over and said, are you missing your mom? And I'm like, yeah. But you're asking me to wash and clean clothes and tend to this need and do that.
His wife.
Right. And even my best friend, Lysandra, the trauma, meaning certain things had to be in place or else I would just be like, I can't do this. And I remember when we went to look for an apartment and they showed me the model. And so when I went back, they gave me a key to a different apartment and I freaked out. I said, no, we cannot stay here. The room was over there and the living room was over here, and I want the one that you showed me. They were like, ma'am, we don't have it. I said, no, we cannot do it. I broke down crying. So my son's father, he calls my best friend. He's like, you need to come over here. And I'm talking to Lysandra, and I mean, I am crying. You would have thought somebody died.
Right.
And it wasn't until recently, we're talking about 30 years later, that I'm able to sit and say, oh God, that was an episode.
Yes.
That was a part of post-traumatic stress disorder.
It built up until it overflowed. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay. So you're listening to Finally Free, because that's why I'm free. Okay. Because I want to talk about it with a psychotherapist. I talk to Jesus all the time, but we also know that there is spiritual. Okay. And there is practical. And when you combine the spiritual with the practical, then you can have a miracle. Now, God doesn't need our help, but he expects us to help ourselves. So thank you for listening and watching to Finally Free with me, Delores Jones, your comeback coach, streaming exclusively on the Fly Nubian Queen Network. Hello, queens and kings, Arthurs out there, dots out there. And also I'm here locally in Kansas City in the Power 98.5 studio. So welcome to all of you all. If you have questions, feel free to chime in. And hey, I'm going to do this, Gerald. I'm going to give out the phone number. The number here is 816-599-6893. 816-599-6893. So, Gerald, this has been really good. And we're going to continue, of course, even off the radio on Fly Nubian Queen. So y'all make sure y'all stay right there. We have people even from Cape Coast, Ghana with me today.
Wow.
Isn't that wonderful? This is great information. So Gerald, here we are. Our husband is a firefighter. Our wife works in the emergency room at a hospital. He comes home. She comes home. The sound of loud noises. I was out dancing one day at the Juke, and a dear friend who happens to be one of your friends who was in the war, it started getting loud. And we were two-stepping, and he said, I have to go.
Right.
And I said, okay. And he says, because
it was taking him
it
back.
was too much. He said, I deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, and he's disabled as a result of that. Is it possible? How challenging is it, firstly, to receive disability for something like that?
Oh, I'm sure you've heard the stories. There are law practices that's all they do is fight for people to get their Social Security disability benefits. That in and of itself says how extremely difficult it is that you have law practices that's exclusively what they do. Wow. It can take people months and months, years, to get their disability benefits.
Yes.
Now, once they get them, yes, they get these huge checks
at the end
that covers that whole time that they were waiting. But what about those who weren't able to make it to that point? What about those people who, they couldn't take months because they're unable to work, because they are struggling with PTSD. And so, because imagine if it would have been a job instead of just being at the juke house. When you're at a job, you can't just leave work because you are experiencing one of your PTSD triggers and you need to escape from it.
Yeah.
And if a person has not, gone through some systematic desensitization therapy to help them desensitize to that, every time they experience that trigger, it takes them back. They experience that intense fear, that hypervigilance, and the flashbacks can end up coming. And some people experience some psychosis. Like, if you're on a job, you can't just leave work at that time. So that's where the disability piece comes in, because they're not exactly in a mental state where they can work and hold down a job. And then we have them waiting months, a year or so to get their disability benefits.
Lose families.
Yes.
Housing.
Yes.
Some of them lose their lives.
Yes.
Like you were talking about the firefighters.
Yes. We have like a number of homeless people in our society. Those are veterans. a lot of
A
times.
huge number.
And
Which is a disgrace, by the way.
It is a disgrace.
You put your life up, you stand in harm's way so that we can stay free.
Right.
And then when you come out of the service risking your life, then we tell you you're on your own.
Right.
Go find a place to sleep under a bridge.
Right. Because they, and they're intoxicated a lot of times, but they're intoxicated because they're attempting to self-medicate.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to use alcohol and drugs to drown out the images of traumatic things that they have witnessed, the sounds of it.
But Gerald, take me back to where you said the desensitization.
Systematic desensitization.
Because I'm trying to figure out how, if I start to share with you do I have to do it every time I see you?
Until it gets to a point where the person, these therapies, evidence-based practices, are therapies that have been studied and researched and implemented and proven to be effective. So what happens is it gets to a point where they're almost like they're able to just go through the story and tell it, and they're
because you told it so much.
Yes, and so they have desensitized to it.
I don't get it.
Let me give you an example. I'm gonna give you a real life example that I use with my clients all the time.
Okay.
One of my sisters, well, two of my sisters are diabetic, but one of my sisters is diabetic and was put on insulin. Now, she had a serious tear of needles. Okay. I'm talking acting a fool in the doctor's office like she didn't have good sense when the needle would come out. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so for her doctor to drop that bomb on her, you're going to have to start taking insulin. Imagine her reaction. Shots? Who? Who? What? Every day?
Who's gonna do that?
Several times a day.
She don't do that.
No, I ain't gonna
be
able to do it. Right. And so it started off with, my brother-in-law kind of giving her the shots. But then as time went on, she had to get to the point where she needed to be able to do it herself, because what if he's not able to do it? What if he's at work? What if he's not available? And so fast forward, I think probably a few weeks, a month, she's able to, bloop, 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 and keep it moving. Because in doing it every day, several times a day, she became desensitized to the point where she was reporting that she wasn't even really feeling the stick of the needle anymore.
So, okay. But
psychologically, therapy, after you go through it, you're able to present the thought that you have surrounding it that is also causing the trauma. Those thoughts like, I really wish I would have thought to do this. Get to the scene of the accident fast enough. And so being in therapy, not only allow a person to present the traumatic experience and go through it enough times to systematically desensitize to it, but it also gives me an opportunity to address their cognitive distortions, which are their thinking errors, those things that they are saying to themselves that it's their fault, or that they didn't do enough, or that they should have done something different. They should have been absolutely perfect in that situation, and then the person would have lived. And so that all needs to come out so that I can address that with them and help to remove that burden from them. It's not their fault.
So you don't start telling the story over and over again with yourself. You need a professional to guide you through that.
Yes, because a lot of things can surface in the process of this. And so a therapist is there to kind of help the person to keep it together.
All right. So I want to help you keep it together today on Finally Free. What we're going to do is we're going to pause for the calls. So I don't want you to leave. And then we'll continue on with this conversation, and we will take some of your questions here right on the Fly Nubian Queen Network. Hello, everybody. San Francisco Bay is there. I am Delores Jones, the host of Finally Free. Sit tight for just a moment. Can you keep recording this, Mr. Walker? Can you keep it recording?
I think so. Just
And then we'll take it out of our headphones? Or
oh, I see what you're saying.
is that okay?
Yeah, you won't have it on the headphones.
Okay.
But
We
I have to record it over
Mhm.
here. And let me stop the Facebook.
I resumed.
And we'll end this.
Queens have to say, we need to answer the Queen's questions.
Hey, Queens, it's Delores Jones again. This is part 2 of my segment about